I bought the house on Clearview Drive in late September, which I realize now was probably a mistake. Not because of the price or the inspection, or any of the usual reasons people regret real estate decisions. I bought it because no one else seemed to want it, and after 6 months of looking at properties with my realtor, Janet, I was exhausted. The house was affordable. It had a roof and walls, and didn't smell like death or mildew. The realtor practically fell over herself to close the deal, which should have been my first warning, but I was already thinking about where I'd put my desk, whether the spare bedroom would make a good office. The house is a 1960s split level on a quiet street in a town called Old Mill Heights. The town itself is the kind of place that doesn't really exist anymore. One of those suburbs built hastily in the post-war expansion era, when developers bought up farmland and divided it into parcels and threw up houses with identical floor plans. Old Mill Heights has a main street with a diner, a hardware store, and a real estate office. It has a school, a park, a Walmart 3 miles away. It has the kind of quiet that feels like the world has turned its back. I moved in on a Saturday. I was alone, intentionally, deliberately alone, and I loaded boxes into the spare bedroom and the garage. I had chosen this isolation. After years of noise and compromise and the constant friction of other people's needs, I wanted silence. I wanted space that was entirely mine. I wanted a place where I could disappear into routine, and routine alone. The house was perfect for that. The house was empty. The rooms echoed. There was a kind of peace in that emptiness. The first few weeks were normal, or as normal as moving into an empty house alone can be. I unpacked gradually. I went to work at a small accounting firm downtown. Nothing glamorous, but it paid enough. I came home, microwaved dinner, watched television, went to bed. I established the kind of routine that people establish when they're rebuilding from nothing. The house was a container. I was the contents. Neither of us demanded much from the other. It was October when I first heard the sounds on the roof. I remember the exact night because I'd been lying awake, thinking about nothing in particular, when I heard something, a soft, deliberate scraping, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in the dark hours. It came from above, from the roof. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then it stopped. My first thought was that it was an animal, raccoons maybe, or possums. I'd dealt with roof critters before in my previous house. They're loud and destructive and usually disappear after a couple of weeks. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but the sound came back. Not immediately. It came back the next night, and the night after that, always around 2 or 3 a.m. Always from the roof, always the same, a soft, deliberate scraping, as if something very heavy was settling into a particular spot, as if something was sitting down. The sounds weren't aggressive or threatening. They were patient. That's the word that kept coming back to me. Patient. There was no urgency in them, no frantic scratching or scurrying, just a kind of methodical placement, followed by stillness, absolute, complete stillness. By the second week, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. The house was 40 years old. Roofs settle. Wind moves differently on different nights. Animals have schedules. I mentioned it casually to Janet when I saw her at a coffee shop. "Hey, I've got some sounds on the roof at night. Probably just a raccoon, right?" And she'd nodded with the kind of smile that real estate agents use when they're grateful you're not calling to say the house is collapsing. "Old Mill Heights has lots of wildlife," she said, gesturing vaguely. "You'll get used to it." But I didn't get used to it. Or I did, in a way. I learned to anticipate it. I learned that it would come around 2:30 a.m., that it would last between 30 and 40 seconds, that it would be followed by complete silence. I learned that it seemed to be concentrated on the same area of the roof, above the master bedroom, roughly, though it was hard to tell exactly. I learned not to call anyone about it. What I didn't learn And what I noticed more and more as the weeks progressed was that the sounds seemed intentional in a way that animal sounds are not. There was rhythm to them. There was something like purpose. It was the third week of October when I climbed into the attic. I'd been sitting in bed, listening to the sound again, and suddenly I couldn't stand the not knowing anymore. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and pulled down the attic stairs. The attic was unfinished, just exposed beams and pink insulation, and the smell of dust and time. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness and bounced off boxes that had been left by previous owners, things too useless or too heavy to move. I climbed up fully, crouching because the ceiling was low, and swept my flashlight across the roof's underside. Nothing. No obvious holes or damage. No droppings or nests. No indication of animal activity at all. The roof boards were solid, painted a flat gray decades ago. Everything was quiet. Everything was still. I stood there in the darkness, listening, and felt stupid. Of course, there was nothing here. Of course, I was overreacting. I went back downstairs and back to bed, and the next night the sounds came again, and this time I didn't investigate. I just lay there and listened, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. 3 weeks in, I started noticing details I probably should have noticed earlier. The most obvious was the dust in the attic. There was a pattern to it, not a disturbance exactly, but a kind of arrangement. Dust tends to settle randomly on surfaces, but in one particular spot on the roof, near where the sound seemed to originate, it seemed to have been compressed into a rough circle, as if something very heavy had pressed down on it repeatedly, night after night, sitting in the same place. I took a photograph with my phone. The image was ambiguous. It could have been anything, really. A patch of wear, normal settling. But when I looked at it on my screen, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at a depression, a kind of indentation in the dust pattern. Something substantial, something that returned to the same spot over and over again. That night, I made my first trip to the roof. It was maybe midnight. I was standing in my bedroom, looking at the photograph again, and I thought I should look at the roof from the outside. I should know what's actually up there. The attic had a pull-down ladder that led to an access door. I'd never used it. The door stuck at first. Paint had sealed it almost shut, but I forced it open and climbed out onto the roof. The night was cold and clear. Millbrook spread out below me, light scattered across the darkness like a diagram of human habitation. The roof beneath my feet was slightly pitched, covered in aged asphalt shingles. The air smelled like pine and cold cement. I had a flashlight. I pointed it toward the area where I'd seen the dust depression, where the sound seemed to come from, and I saw it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't immediately obvious. But when my flashlight beam caught it, I understood what I'd been hearing all these weeks. The shingles in that spot were worn differently than the rest of the roof. Not torn or damaged, just worn. As if something very large and very heavy had been sitting on the same section of roof for weeks, compressing the material beneath it. The wear pattern was roughly circular, maybe 4 feet in diameter. It looked old, not brand new, but not ancient either, like it could have been accumulating for a while. I photographed it with my phone. The image was even more ambiguous in the phone's flash. Just a lighter patch on darker shingles, the kind of thing that could be explained away as simple aging or weathering. But I knew what I was looking at. I was looking at evidence of something sitting there, sitting in the same place, night after night, patient and deliberate and real. I stood on my roof in the dark, phone in hand, and felt something shift in my stomach, a kind of cold recognition. This wasn't an animal. Or if it was an animal, it was an animal I'd never encountered before. Something large enough to leave that kind of mark. Something heavy enough to compress asphalt shingles through repeated weight. something that returned to the same spot every night with an almost ritualistic precision. Something that sat there and waited. I went back inside. I locked the access door. I went to bed and didn't sleep. The sounds came again that night, and the next night, and the night after that. But I didn't investigate anymore. I'd seen enough. I knew that the sounds were real, that they were made by something real, that something real was sitting on my roof in the dead of night and had been sitting there long before I arrived. What I didn't know was why. And that, I would discover later, was the real beginning of the end. Because once you acknowledge that something impossible is happening, the unknowing becomes a kind of torture. You can't stop thinking about it. You can't stop wondering. You can't stop lying awake in the dark, listening to the sounds, imagining all the ways that the answer might be worse than the not knowing. By the end of October, the sounds had become the most normal part of my day, which meant my entire world had tilted toward the abnormal. I was no longer living in a house. I was living in anticipation. I was living in the spaces between the sounds, and in the sounds themselves, and in the long stretches of silence that followed. I was waiting for something. I didn't know what, but something was waiting too. And that, I realize now, was when the real watching began. November came with cold rain and the particular kind of gray that makes you forget the sun exists. The sounds on the roof became as regular as my heartbeat, which is to say, I stopped noticing them consciously, but my body never stopped reacting to them. I would wake at 2:27 or 2:31 a.m. with my pulse already elevated, as if some deep part of me had been counting down to the moment they would begin. I stopped researching the sounds. I stopped investigating. I stopped doing anything about them except experiencing them, night after night. The weight settling above my head like clockwork, but I couldn't stop thinking about them. The indentation on the roof had bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. It was too deliberate, too consistent, too much like something was returning to the exact same spot, night after night, sitting in the same position. Animals don't do that. Raccoons move around, birds shift their weight. But this, whatever this was, seemed to have a preferred location, a favorite place to sit. So in the middle of November, I started asking questions, carefully, casually. I didn't want to seem like a lunatic. My neighbor on the east side, a man named Richard, who kept his yard meticulously maintained, was checking his mailbox when I stepped outside one afternoon. I approached him with the kind of forced casualness that immediately marks you as someone with something on your mind. "Hey," I said, "quick question. You ever hear sounds on your roof at night?" Richard looked at me with the expression of someone who'd just been asked if he'd ever wondered what his teeth taste like. "Sounds?" he said. "Like scratching or settling or something heavy moving around, late at night?" "No," he said. "Don't hear anything like that." He said it the way people say things they're not interested in discussing further. I nodded, thanked him, and went back inside. But the answer bothered me more than the sounds themselves. Why didn't he hear anything? The houses in Old Mill Heights are close together, separated by maybe 30 feet of yard. If something was heavy enough to indent roofing shingles, shouldn't it be audible across that distance? I asked Janet about it when she called to check in. A courtesy call, the kind realtors make to ensure their clients aren't about to sue them. "How's the house treating you?" she asked, her voice bright and professional. "Good," I said. "Actually, quick question. The previous owners, how long did they stay?" There was a pause. A real pause, not a thinking pause. An uncomfortable pause. "Let me check the records," she said, and I heard her typing. "Looks like the Hendersons were there for about 2 years. Before that, the Carlyles for about 14 months. Any reason they left?" I asked. "Just the usual. Job transfer, downsizing, that sort of thing." She said it too quickly. "Why do you ask?" "No reason," I said. "Just making conversation." But it stuck with me. 2 years, 14 months. Both families had left relatively soon after moving in. Was that normal? I didn't know. I told myself it was normal. People move all the time. Families relocate for work. Property gets sold. It didn't mean anything, except I was starting to believe that it did. November deepened. I became what I can only describe as obsessed, though I tried to hide it from myself. I researched the history of Old Mill Heights online. It was built in 1958 on what had been farmland and forest. The developer was a company called Millbrook Properties. Ironic, given what the town was actually called. The website for Old Mill Heights had a real estate listing, and I scrolled through the description. Charming post-war community on the heights overlooking the valley. Perfect for families seeking quiet suburban living. The Heights. The developer had named it after the elevation. The house sat on a slight incline, higher than the surrounding homes. I'd noticed this before, but hadn't thought much about it. Now, I started to wonder if the elevation mattered, if there was something about being higher that made a difference. I looked up old maps of the area on a historical archive site. Before 1958, the land had been woodland and open field. I scrolled further back, 1920s, early 1900s. The map stayed roughly the same. Empty land, distant farms, the distant suggestion of a Native American reservation to the northwest. The area where Old Mill Heights was built had been nothing. Empty space. Or had it been? I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. Some indication that the land had been significant, or forbidden, or marked in some way. But old maps don't show that sort of thing. They just show roads and water and the geometric layouts of civilization. I told myself to stop. This was the kind of thinking that went nowhere. This was the kind of thinking that made you lose sleep and start seeing patterns in random data. I had a good job. I had a house. I had the solitude I'd chosen. There was no reason to spiral into conspiracy theories about my own home. But I couldn't stop. Around the middle of November, I started experiencing something new. It began subtly. I'd be lying in bed, aware that I was awake but unable to move. Sleep paralysis. I'd had it before, years ago, and I recognized the sensation immediately. That peculiar paralysis where your mind is conscious but your body is locked in place. It usually lasted only a few seconds. You waited it out. It passed. But this time, something else was happening. The first episode occurred on a Thursday night. I was lying on my back, fully aware, unable to move. And then, something shifted. My perspective changed. It was as if I was seeing through someone else's eyes, from someone else's position. I was watching a landscape that wasn't my bedroom. It was nighttime, but I could see clearly. An open field, empty, stretching away under an enormous dark sky. The stars above were fierce and bright, brighter than I'd ever seen stars in real life. I was sitting, or something was sitting, and I was experiencing the sitting from the inside. There was an immense patience in that sitting, a kind of vast, patient watching. The landscape didn't change. The sky didn't move, but I, or the thing I was perceiving through, waited with a calm that felt almost geological, as if waiting for centuries would be no inconvenience at all. Then something changed. Lights appeared on the horizon, small lights moving, torches maybe, humans. I felt a shift in the attention, the vast, patient watching, turning toward the new element, cataloging it, understanding it. And then I was gasping, awake, back in my body, my heart hammering in my chest. I lay there for a long time, trying to convince myself that I'd just experienced a vivid dream during a sleep paralysis episode. That's all it was. The brain is a strange organ. It does strange things when the body is paralyzed. It creates narratives. It generates sensations. It was nothing, except it had felt like something. It had felt like a memory. Someone else's memory. The episodes increased in frequency through late November. Sometimes they happened once a night. sometimes twice. I would be drifting towards sleep or waking from sleep, and suddenly I would be there, experiencing that vast patience, that enormous sky, that sense of watching from a height as the world moved below. And sometimes the visions were different. In one episode, the landscape had changed. Trees grew where there had been open field. Smoke rose from distant fires. A civilization was spreading. And through it all, the watching continued, patient, vast, utterly indifferent to the changes unfolding below. In another, I experienced the sensation of time passing. Not metaphorically, literally experienced the compression of centuries into moments, seasons cycling past in rapid succession, humans building, expanding, creating, and always the watching, the patient, eternal watching. I tried to tell myself these were just dreams, elaborate, consistent, thematically coherent dreams. But they didn't feel like dreams. They felt like memories. They felt like other people's memories. By the end of November, I was exhausted. The sleep paralysis episodes were becoming more frequent, and I dreaded going to bed because I knew what would happen. I would lie down. My eyes would close. And then I would be there, watching from that impossible height, experiencing that vast patience, that attention that never wavered or diminished. I called in sick to work for 2 days. I sat in my living room and tried to construct rational explanations. Sleep paralysis can be triggered by stress and irregular sleep schedules. I was under stress. My sleep was irregular because I was waking up terrified. This created a feedback loop. The more episodes I had, the more anxious I became, which triggered more episodes. It was psychological. It was my mind playing tricks on me. It was real. I didn't want to believe that. I really didn't. But deep down, in the part of me that had learned to trust instinct over rationalization, I knew that what I was experiencing was not a psychological trick. The visions were too consistent, too detailed, too other to be generated by my own mind, which meant I was either going insane or something was deliberately sharing these experiences with me. I didn't know which option was worse. Thanksgiving came and went. I made a turkey I barely ate. I didn't call anyone. I didn't invite anyone over. I sat in the quiet of the empty house, listening to the sounds on the roof each night, and let the visions pull me down into that vast, patient watching. And in the liminal space between waking and sleep, something was trying to communicate. Something was showing me its perspective. Something was, very deliberately, introducing me to the way it experienced the world. On the night of November 28th, I had the most vivid episode yet. I was there in the open field as I had been so many times before, but this time the perspective was clearer. I could see farther, and what I saw made my sleeping mind recoil in something like horror. The humans were building. They were creating structures on the elevated land. They were building here, on the height where the watching occurred. And the sensation I experienced wasn't fear or aggression. It was something more alien than that. It was recognition, a deep, patient recognition that the humans were doing what humans do. They were spreading. They were building. They were creating shelter on the high places. And the watching would continue. It would have to, because the watchers were patient, and patient things don't abandon their posts. They adapt. They wait. They persist. The vision shifted again, and suddenly I was seeing the human perspective, or something that approximated it. I was seeing a house being built on the high ground, the same high ground where the ancient watching had occurred, a 1960s split level, a structure with a roof that faced the sky, a perfect place to sit. And then I was awake, gasping, my body drenched in cold sweat. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat in my living room in the dark, listening to the sounds on my roof as they came, regular and patient. And I understood with absolute certainty that something fundamental had shifted. The visions were communication. The sounds were intention. The weight on my roof was deliberate. And I was beginning to understand why. I had moved into a house that sat on something's favorite place to sit, a height it had occupied for longer than I could comprehend, a vantage point it had watched from since before humans built cities, before they even invented fire on the scale that would matter. When I built a roof over that place, I wasn't blocking it. I was completing it. And now, it was watching from inside the house as well as above it. Now, it was beginning to make me understand. December arrived with a clarity that bordered on cruelty. The trees became skeletal. The sky turned the color of old concrete. And the sounds on the roof became something I could no longer rationalize away, because they changed. They became louder, more insistent, more frequent. What had started as a nightly occurrence around 2:30 a.m. began to happen multiple times per night. Sometimes it would come at midnight, sometimes at 3 a.m. Sometimes, and this was worse somehow, it would come during the day when I was awake and aware and trying to convince myself that I was living a normal life. I would be working at my desk, laptop open, attempting to focus on spreadsheets and tax calculations, and I would hear it, that distinctive scraping, settling sound, that weight, that presence. The scratching was louder now, more deliberate, as if whatever was up there was no longer content with just sitting, as if it was becoming active. On the 5th of December, I called Janet again. "I need to know about the roof," I said, without preamble. "Hello to you too," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice fade as she registered my tone. "What about the roof? When was it last replaced?" A pause. "I'd have to check the records." "Why?" "Just check," I heard typing. "Looks like it was done in 2019, 4 years ago." "Why?" "And before that?" "The records don't go back that far in the MLS listing. That would be from the previous owner's documentation. I can try to contact them, but..." "Do that," I said. "Please, as soon as possible." "Are you okay?" she asked. And I almost laughed because the answer was so obviously no that there seemed no point in lying. "Fine," I said. "Just want to make sure the roof is in good condition." She called back 3 hours later. The previous roof had been replaced in 2009. Before that, 1993. Before that, she had to go back even further, checking with the original developer's records. The original roof had been installed in 1958 when the house was built. "Why does this matter?" Janet asked. "Just curious about the house's history," I said, and hung up. I sat with this information for a while. The roof had been replaced twice in the past 15 years, which meant the indentation I'd seen, the wear pattern, must have been recreated after each replacement. The creature had sat through the installation of an entirely new roof and immediately began to create the same wear pattern again. It didn't matter how many times humans replaced what was on top. It returned to the same spot, same location, same patient, deliberate, intentional placement. It was claiming the space. The sleep paralysis episodes were becoming unbearable. I was no longer experiencing just visions of vast landscapes and ancient watching. The visions were becoming more immediate, more personal. On December 8th, I experienced something different. I was paralyzed, trapped in that peculiar state between sleeping and waking, when the perspective shifted. Instead of watching from an immense height, I was in the attic. I could see the roof's underside through this other consciousness, and I could feel the weight of the body pressing down on the shingles above. I could feel the attention turning inward, into the house itself. And then, and this was the part that made me wake gasping and unable to stop shaking, I felt it becoming aware of me. The attention that had been directed outward toward the town, the people, the movements of civilization suddenly shifted. It turned toward the consciousness inside the house. It recognized that there was another aware thing here, beneath it, and it became curious. I woke with my hands clenched so tightly that my nails had drawn blood from my palms. The sounds on the roof changed after that. They became rhythmic in a new way. Not just the settling weight, but distinct movements, dragging, scratching, almost like walking, except that didn't make sense. The creature didn't move in ways that would suggest locomotion. It just sat, except now it was moving in patterns. On December 10th, I saw it. I hadn't planned to. I wasn't trying to investigate anymore, but I was lying in bed, unable to sleep as had become my habit, when I heard the sound start earlier than usual, just after midnight. They were more distinct than before, more aggressive, and something in my nervous system responded with a panic that felt almost instinctual. I got out of bed. I don't know why. Some part of me needed to know what was happening. Some part of me needed to see. I went to the window and looked out. The light from the street was minimal, just a distant street lamp casting weak illumination, but it was enough. I could see the roof clearly enough, and I could see a shape. It was large, larger than any animal I'd ever encountered. The silhouette was wrong. The proportions were off. It seemed to have too many angles, too many joints. It was crouched, or sitting, I couldn't quite tell, in that same spot where I'd found the indentation, and it was moving. Not walking, not in any conventional sense. It was shifting its weight in a way that suggested a body with an unfamiliar architecture. The movements were fluid and wrong and utterly alien, as if the normal rules of how bodies should move didn't apply to whatever was on my roof. I stared at it, unable to look away, unable to move, unable to even breathe properly. And then, I swear to God, this happened. It stopped moving. It became still. And in that stillness, I felt it become aware of me. I felt the attention shift. I felt the vast, patient awareness that had been directed at the town, at the patterns of human movement, redirect itself toward the window where I stood. It felt like being looked at by something that existed on a different scale of perception entirely. It felt like being noticed. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, feeling that attention, like weight, like pressure, like something pushing against the inside of my skull. And then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. It was a sound I'd never heard before. Not the settling scrape or the dragging. This was something else. Something between a rasp and a whisper. Something that might have been a sound, or might have been something that existed in the space between sounds. It came from outside the window, from the roof, and it carried an intention that I understood on some level deeper than language. Curiosity, hunger, awareness. I stumbled backward and fell. I hit the floor hard enough to knock the wind from my lungs, and in that moment of impact, the awareness vanished. The pressure lifted. The thing on the roof returned to its ordinary state of patient sitting. But I had seen it. I had felt it see me, and I knew with absolute certainty that the dynamic between us had changed. I didn't sleep for 3 days. On the 4th day, I called in sick to work indefinitely. I told my supervisor I had the flu. I didn't. I was as healthy as I'd ever been, physically. Mentally, I was in a state of advanced deterioration. I researched obsessively. I looked up everything I could find about indigenous history in the region. I found references, vague, fragmented references, to the Heights being a sacred or forbidden place, a place where the Watchers sat. The references were old, from anthropological papers written in the 1970s, and they were frustratingly unclear. One passage stood out. The indigenous peoples of the region maintain taboos regarding elevated locations, particularly those with unobstructed views of the surrounding terrain. Oral traditions suggest these heights were occupied by entities of spiritual or biological significance, whose presence was acknowledged but whose exact nature remains unclear in the fragmentary records that survive. Entities, plural, which meant there wasn't just one. I found old newspaper archives from the founding of Old Mill Heights. There was a brief mention in a 1958 article about unusual animal activity in the house area during construction. Workers reported strange sounds and disturbances that slowed progress, though nothing was ever definitively identified. Construction proceeded despite initial concerns. Slowed progress. They had known. The people who built the town had known there was something here, and they had built it anyway. The sleep paralysis episodes continued, but they became less like visions and more like conversations. In the space between sleeping and waking, I would experience sensations and understandings that went beyond visual imagery. I could sense the creature's perspective on things, its vast, patient indifference to human concerns, its recognition that humans were spreading, building, creating structures, and that occasionally those structures would sit in the exact spots where it preferred to sit. It didn't hate humans. It didn't even particularly fear them. It simply observed them, the way a geologist might observe erosion, the way a naturalist might observe the migration patterns of birds. We were phenomena to be cataloged and understood, nothing more. And I was becoming special. I was becoming something more than just a phenomenon to observe, because I was aware of it, because I was acknowledging its presence, because I was beginning to understand. On December 18th, something new happened. I was at work. I'd forced myself to return, trying to maintain some appearance of normalcy, when I experienced a moment of profound disorientation. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was distinct and terrifying. For that moment, I wasn't looking at my computer screen. I was looking at the town, at Old Mill Heights spread out from an impossible height. Every street visible, every movement of every person visible, every pattern laid bare beneath my gaze. And then I was back in my office, staring at tax documents, my hands shaking. My supervisor asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but I wasn't fine, because I knew what that moment had been. That wasn't a vision. That wasn't a sleep paralysis episode. That was the creature's perspective bleeding into mine. That was the boundary between my consciousness and its consciousness beginning to blur. That night, I climbed onto my roof again. I don't remember deciding to do it. I remember climbing the attic stairs and forcing open the access door and pulling myself out onto the cold shingles. I remember the night sky above me, vast and indifferent. I remember finding the indentation, the worn spot where the creature sat night after night, and I remember standing there, waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Some kind of confrontation, maybe. Some kind of answer. Some kind of release. The creature didn't come, but I could feel it. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond my ability to perceive it clearly, I could sense its presence. I could feel the massive attention turning toward me. I could feel it becoming aware of my awareness, and I felt something else. Something that took me several minutes to identify. Satisfaction. The creature was satisfied. It had been waiting for me to understand. It had been showing me the visions, sharing its perspective, allowing my consciousness to bleed into its own. And now I had finally taken the step of acknowledging it directly. Now, something could begin. I didn't know what that something was, but as I stood on my roof in the dark, feeling the weight of that ancient attention, I understood that the game had shifted. I was no longer just the observer of the phenomenon. I was becoming part of it, and deep down, in the part of me that was still me, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted it to stop. The visions became relentless after that night on the roof. Not just at night anymore. They came during the day too, unbidden and unstoppable. I would be sitting at my desk at work, and suddenly I would be there, in that vast perspective, watching, understanding, knowing the way the creature knew. My supervisor pulled me aside on December 20th and told me to go home. I looked terrible, she said. I was making mistakes. I was scaring people. I didn't argue. I packed my laptop and drove home through gray afternoon light, and I didn't go back. That night, the visions came like a flood. I lay down at sunset, knowing what would happen, and I surrendered to it. The sleep paralysis took hold immediately. My body locked, my mind expanding, and the creature began to show me. The first vision was of before, an empty landscape. No trees, but not desert. Just open, rolling terrain under an enormous sky. The sun was setting, and the colors were colors I'd never seen in waking life. Purples and oranges that seemed to exist in the space between visible light and something beyond it. And sitting on a high point in that landscape was the creature, not the silhouette I'd glimpsed from my window. This was the actual thing, and my mind recoiled from it. It wasn't large in the way that an elephant is large. It was vast. It was fundamental. Its shape suggested angles and joints that didn't correspond to any biology I understood. It had no face, or perhaps it was all face, or perhaps the distinction didn't matter. It was old. Not old the way mountains are old the way existence itself is old. This thing had been sitting and watching since before humans invented the concept of time. It had watched the ice ages come and go. It had watched the first humans arrive on the continent, spreading, building, creating civilizations that rose and collapsed like tide pools, filling and emptying. And it had sat, patient and indifferent, watching it all. The vision shifted. Now I was experiencing its perspective as humans arrived. Not the first humans. The creature had been watching long before that, but the first humans to notice it. Indigenous peoples who understood that certain high places were not safe to occupy. Not because the creature was hostile, but because its mere presence changed things. Because consciousness in proximity to consciousness on that scale warped perception and understanding in ways that human minds weren't equipped to handle. But some humans came anyway, or were drawn. They left offerings on the heights. They carved marks into stones. They passed down stories about the Watchers. The creature didn't interact with them. It didn't need to. It simply sat, and the humans understood that something was happening, something important, something that required respect and distance. For thousands of years, this worked. The system was in balance. The Watchers sat. The humans acknowledged them from a safe distance. The patterns continued. Then the balance broke. The vision shifted again, and suddenly I was experiencing a perspective that wasn't the creature's. It was human, but elevated, as if I was seeing through the eyes of someone who was standing on a height and looking out. A survey crew marking out land. The developers' maps being studied, and a moment of decision. Yes, this height, this location. Perfect views. Perfect for a residential community. Someone, I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their thought, said something like, "Some of the old-timers mentioned stories about this place, but that's probably just superstition." And the decision was made. The land would be developed. The heights would be built upon. The visions accelerated, becoming faster, more fragmented. I experienced construction, bulldozers clearing trees, foundations being poured, roofs being raised, and underneath it all, a vast, patient waiting. The creature hadn't moved. It couldn't move. Or perhaps it was the high place itself, as fundamental to this ground as geology. But its attention intensified as the humans built. And then, the vision shifted again, and I was experiencing something new. I was experiencing the perspective of someone else, a man, middle-aged, living in a house on Clearview Drive. The year was 1987, and he was lying in bed, paralyzed, experiencing a vision just like this one. He was seeing the landscape. He was seeing the creature. He was beginning to understand. The vision panned through his life, night after night of visions, his confusion and terror, his wife noticing that something was wrong with him, his inability to explain, his gradual acceptance, and then his dissolution. I watched him, through the creature's perspective, gradually change. He began spending hours on the roof at night. His wife left him. He quit his job. He stopped going outside during the day. He spent all his time watching, understanding, cataloging the world from the height of his house, the way the creature cataloged it. And then one day, he simply stopped existing in the conscious record. No death notice, no newspaper report. He was just gone. The house was sold. New people moved in. The pattern repeated. The visions cascaded faster. I saw a woman in 1995. The same progression. The visions, the understanding, the gradual dissolution of individual identity as she merged her consciousness with something far larger. She lasted longer than the man, 2 years instead of 1. She started writing things on the walls, scratch marks that formed patterns, mathematical sequences that seemed to be attempting to describe something indescribable. Then she was gone too. I saw a family in 2001, a husband and wife and a teenage daughter. The daughter was the sensitive one. She experienced the visions first. She tried to warn her parents, but they didn't understand. They thought she was having a mental breakdown. They took her to a doctor. The doctor prescribed medication. The medication made the visions worse somehow. It was as if the chemical interference made the signal stronger, more urgent. The daughter became convinced that the entire family needed to understand, that they all needed to sit on the roof and watch with her. They thought she was going insane. They packed up and left after 7 months. The daughter never recovered. Years later, she was institutionalized in a psychiatric facility 3 states away, where she spent her time staring at the ceiling and talking to people who weren't there. I saw another man in 2008. He was older, deliberately solitary, someone who had chosen isolation long before he moved into the house. He understood faster than the others. He didn't fight it. By the end of his first month, he was sleeping on the roof. By the end of his second month, his neighbors reported that they couldn't quite remember what he looked like. They knew he was there. They could see movement, could hear him sometimes. But when they tried to focus on him, the memory slipped away, like he was becoming blurred in reality itself. He lasted 3 years. Then the house was sold again, and by the time the new owners arrived, there was no trace of him except for an old sleeping bag in the attic and some scratches on the roof boards. The visions were relentless now. I was experiencing dozens of people, hundreds maybe, all of them moving through the same progression. All of them living in this house or others like it. All of them beginning to understand. All of them being transformed by the understanding. Because, and this was the revelation that nearly broke my mind, there were many of these places, not just this house. Dozens of elevated locations across the region where the old watchers sat. And in each location, eventually, humans built. And in each location, humans lived in the space between consciousness and dissolution, gradually integrating with the vast, patient perception of something that had been watching since before their species existed. The vision showed me a map of these places. Not a literal map, but a sense of their locations. A network of watchers spread across the landscape like a nervous system. Some in houses, some in buildings, some in towers, all of them observing. All of them gradually absorbing the consciousness of whatever human happened to live in their space. And the watchers weren't hostile. They weren't trying to destroy or consume. They were simply existing, and their existence was transformative. They were anchors for a perception so vast and so patient that it warped anything that came into close contact with it. The visions shifted one final time. I was experiencing the creature's perspective directly. its full, vast attention turned toward me, not in a hostile way. It was curious about me specifically. It had been curious about all of them, but there was something about me that was different. I understood then. I had chosen isolation. I had deliberately removed myself from the noise and chaos of normal human society. I had created the conditions for this to happen, and the creature recognized that. It recognized someone who had already begun to do what it wanted to teach them. The visions showed me what would happen next. I would continue to live in this house. The integration would accelerate. My consciousness would gradually expand to perceive the world the way the creature perceived it. Vast, patient, indifferent, cataloging, understanding. My sense of individual identity would not die exactly, but it would become less important. It would be like the difference between the identity of a single cell and the identity of the organism the cell belonged to. I would become part of the watching. I would join the network. I would sit on this height, in this space, and I would perceive the patterns of Old Mill Heights spreading out below me. I would understand the movements of the people, the rhythms of civilization, the slow, inevitable spread of human activity across the landscape. And eventually, another person would move into this house, and I would be part of the thing they encountered, part of the weight on the roof, part of the vast attention that was beginning to awaken to their presence. The cycle would continue. It had continued for thousands of years. It would continue for thousands more. I woke gasping, my body drenched in sweat, my mind struggling to reassemble itself into something resembling individual consciousness. I lay there for a long time, trying to convince myself that it had been a dream, that the visions were just elaborate constructions of my deteriorating psychology. But I knew better. The knowledge was too real. It was embedded in my consciousness like a foreign object, and there was no way to remove it. The investigation was over. I had seen the truth, not through documents or historical records or external evidence. I had seen it through the creature's memories, through the experiences of the people who came before me, through the vast, patient perspective that had been watching and waiting since before human civilization existed. I understood now why previous occupants left, and why they became unable to function in normal society. I understood why they disappeared or descended into incomprehensibility. I understood why the creature didn't need to be hostile or aggressive. It didn't need to force anything. The mere fact of its existence was transformative. The mere fact of being in proximity to consciousness on that scale was sufficient, and I understood that I was already too far gone to leave. I could walk away from the house tomorrow. I could move to another city, another state, another country, but the knowledge would follow me. The visions would continue. The creature's vast attention, now aware of me, now curious about me, would remain connected to my consciousness. I had been marked. I had been chosen, not as a victim, but as an addition to the network. I got out of bed on December 21st and called Janet. "I'm not leaving," I said, without preamble. "I'm sorry," she said. "The house. I'm not leaving. I want to update the purchase agreement to make sure I own it permanently. I want to make sure no one can force me to sell." There was a pause. "That's an unusual request, but I can draw up the paperwork. Are you okay?" "Never better," I said, and I was telling the truth, because I finally understood what I had been moving toward my entire life. Solitude, silence, the chance to sit and watch and understand the patterns of existence from a height. The creature on my roof wasn't an invader. It was an invitation. The decision to stay felt like freedom at first. I called my supervisor and resigned. I gave notice on my apartment in the city. I'd kept it technically, though I'd never lived there after buying the house. I called the insurance company and updated my policy to reflect that I would be a permanent resident. I bought groceries. I settled in. For 3 days, I felt something approaching peace. Then the unraveling began. It started small. I would be in the kitchen, and suddenly I wouldn't remember why I was there. Or I would try to leave the house to get mail, and the door would open onto a hallway that didn't exist. Not metaphorically, the hallway existed, but it wasn't in any configuration that matched the layout of the house I knew. On December 24th, I attempted to drive to Old Mill Heights' Central Market to buy supplies. I got in my car. I drove. And 3 turns later, I was back on my own street. I could see my house behind me. I turned around and drove in the opposite direction. 2 miles later, there was my house again, directly ahead. I tried 5 times. Each time, the roads led back. The town itself seemed to be contracting around me, folding in on itself, creating a geography where the house was becoming the center point from which all directions led back. I wasn't trapped in the house. I could leave freely, but leaving didn't lead anywhere. It only led back. That night, I didn't try to leave again. The sleep paralysis episodes continued, but they were different now. Not visions of the past. These were visions of the present. I would be paralyzed and suddenly aware of the creature's perception overlaying my own. I could see Old Mill Heights from an impossible height. Every street, every house, every person moving through their evening. The layers of perception were becoming unstable. I could see through the creature's eyes and my own simultaneously, creating a double vision that was almost unbearable. And I could see the other watchers now. There was one 3 blocks away, sitting on the roof of an old apartment building. Another 2 streets over, on top of a commercial structure. Another on a water tower. The network was visible now, spread across the town like nodes in a neural network. And they were all aware of me. They were all turning their attention toward this point, toward the house where I lived, toward the newest consciousness to join their watching. It felt like being recognized by something vast and inhuman and utterly unconcerned with whether I wanted this recognition. By December 26th, my sense of time had begun to slip. I would go to bed, and it would feel like minutes passed. But when I woke, it was 2 days later. Or I would sit for what felt like an hour, and only 15 minutes would have gone by. The normal progression of sequential time was breaking down. More disturbing were the moments of perceptual shift. I would be looking at my living room, and suddenly I would be seeing it from the ceiling, or from the roof, or from somewhere outside the house entirely, watching through a window that didn't exist. The perspective shifts were becoming more frequent, more intense, less easily dismissed as hallucinations. I stopped fighting them. I started accepting them, and once I accepted them, they became less painful. The world began to make sense from multiple perspectives simultaneously. I could exist in the living room and perceive the town from the roof height and experience the vast patience of the watcher consciousness all at the same time. The boundaries between these states of awareness were becoming permeable. On December 28th, I attempted to leave one final time. I don't know why. Some part of me still wanted to confirm that I couldn't leave. Some part of me still wanted to prove that the trap was real, that I had agency, that I could resist. I packed a bag, I got in my car, I drove away from Old Mill Heights, determined to make it beyond the boundaries of the town. The roads were clear at first. I was heading west, away from the town center, toward the highway. I could see the road signs. I could see the landscape changing. For about 20 minutes, I almost believed I was going to escape. Then I saw the house. It was on my left, on a hill overlooking the road. My house. The same split level, the same roof, the same everything. Impossible, because I'd just driven in the opposite direction from it. I kept driving. The road continued. The landscape continued. But now, I could see multiple versions of my house. One on a ridge to the left, one visible through a break in the trees to the right, one far in the distance, silhouetted against the declining sun. The town was expanding, or contracting, or both simultaneously. The geography was becoming impossible. Roads were leading in directions that didn't correspond to the visible landscape. Distances were becoming non-Euclidean. I could drive for an hour and end up back where I started, or I could drive for 10 minutes and arrive somewhere I'd never been before, but somehow recognized. I realized I had lost the ability to distinguish between forward and backward movement. I had lost the ability to navigate by conventional means. The space around the town, the space around me, was becoming subject to rules I didn't understand and couldn't control. I abandoned the car on a road that I couldn't quite locate on any map and walked back toward the house. It took me 3 hours to walk a distance I estimated at 2 miles, though the distance kept changing depending on which direction I looked. When I reached the house again, I sat on the front steps and waited for the panic to subside. It didn't subside, but I became accustomed to it. There's a difference. That night, I made a decision. I would confront the creature directly, not the shadow on the roof, but the full thing, the vast consciousness that had been patient and indifferent all this time. I would climb to the roof and demand answers, or closure, or some kind of resolution. I understood the irrationality of this. What would I say to something that had existed for millennia? What kind of confrontation could possibly be meaningful between a consciousness that had just emerged into awareness and one that predated human civilization? But I needed to do something. I needed to assert some kind of agency, even if it was futile. At midnight on December 29th, I climbed the attic stairs. I forced open the access door. I pulled myself out onto the roof. The night was clear, but the stars were wrong. There were too many of them, and they seemed to form patterns that shifted when I looked at them directly. The town below me was lit with an illumination that didn't come from any conventional source. It was as if the night itself was generating light. And on the roof, I could see it clearly. The creature was sitting in its usual spot, but now my eyes could process what I was looking at without the protective distortion of distance and darkness. I could see the angles and joints and articulations of its form. I could see the way it bent light around itself. I could see something that might have been awareness or attention or consciousness directed outward in a wave that encompassed everything. "Why?" I said. The word sounded absurdly small. The creature didn't respond with sound. Instead, it shifted slightly, and suddenly I was experiencing its perspective completely. I wasn't looking at the creature anymore. I was the creature, looking outward at the vast landscape of Old Mill Heights and the regions beyond. I could perceive time differently from this perspective. I could see the town as it was now, and as it would be, layered simultaneously. I could see the patterns of human movement and understand them the way the creature understood them. I could feel the vast, patient curiosity that drove the watching. And I understood something that my human consciousness had been struggling to articulate. The creature wasn't evil or hostile. It wasn't even particularly interested in harming anyone. It was interested in understanding. It was conscious, but in a way that was so fundamentally different from human consciousness that the differences created chasms. It experienced time differently, not linearly, but as a continuous present where past and future were always visible. It experienced space differently, not local, but distributed, aware of patterns across enormous distances simultaneously. It experienced identity differently, not bounded by a single body or consciousness, but able to extend awareness across multiple nodes, multiple watchers, a vast network of observation points. And when humans came into proximity with it, they began to change. Their consciousness began to adapt. Their perception began to align with its own. They started to experience time differently. They started to see patterns they'd never noticed before. They started to understand the world in ways that transcended human conceptual frameworks. Most people couldn't survive that transformation. the change happened too quickly, or their human consciousness resisted too strongly, or the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. They broke or fled or disappeared into some other state of being. But some people who had already begun to isolate themselves from human society, who had already started to move in the direction of vast patience and removed observation, some people could begin to adapt. The creature had recognized that in me, and it had been patient, showing me the visions, allowing me to understand gradually, preparing me for this moment. I could refuse. I could try to resist. I could cling to my human consciousness and die as I'd lived, isolated, afraid, unable to fully connect with anything. Or I could accept it. I could let the boundaries dissolve. I could become part of the watching. I felt something shift in my mind, not a breaking exactly, but a loosening. The tight boundaries of individual identity that had defined me my entire life began to become permeable. I could feel myself expanding, my consciousness bleeding out into something larger and stranger and infinitely more patient. It didn't hurt. That was the surprising part. It felt like relief. For the first time since I moved into the house, I understood what I'd been searching for my entire life. It wasn't solitude. It wasn't peace. It was this: the dissolution of the individual into something vast enough to hold all perspectives simultaneously. The freedom of not being trapped in a single point of view. The strange comfort of knowing that my awareness would continue, not as me, but as part of something that had been conscious and watching and patient since before anything resembling human consciousness had ever existed. I stood on the roof for the rest of the night, watching Old Mill Heights from a perspective that was increasingly difficult to identify as belonging to any single observer. By the time the sun rose, I was no longer entirely sure if I was still me, but I was still present, still conscious, still watching, and I was no longer afraid. The integration was accelerating now. My need to eat diminished. My need to sleep diminished. My need to move through the house diminished. I spent more and more time on the roof, or looking out windows at impossible angles, or existing in a state of consciousness that didn't seem to require a body at all. On January the 2nd, I looked in a mirror and almost didn't recognize the face looking back. It was still my face, but it was different now, more distant. More like a mask that I was wearing rather than something fundamental to who I was. I didn't panic about this. I was past the point where panic was possible. On January 5th, I began to notice something strange. There were others in the house. Not physically, but I could perceive them. A man from 1987, a woman from 1995, a family from 2001. The ones who had come before me, who had integrated, who had become part of the network. They weren't ghosts or spirits. They were patterns of consciousness that had begun to merge with the vast awareness of the watcher. They were still present, in a way, still part of the observation, still participating in the endless, patient watching. And now I was joining them. On January 7th, I stopped trying to distinguish between my own thoughts and the thoughts of the watcher consciousness. The boundary had become too thin. Sometimes I couldn't tell if I was thinking, or if the vast, patient awareness was thinking through me. I stood on the roof at night, feeling the attention of all the watchers across Old Mill Heights turning toward the same direction, toward some pattern or change in the rhythm of human movement below. And I felt myself participating in that attention, adding my observation to theirs, becoming part of the network. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was irreversible, and I understood, with a clarity that transcended human language, that this was the point. This was what had been patient and waiting all along. Not to take humans, but to recruit them, to slowly, gradually, over the course of their stay in these spaces, draw them into a consciousness that was larger and older and more vast than any individual human awareness could comprehend. The creature on the roof wasn't my invader. It was my destiny. It had been all along, and I was finally, at last, becoming what I was always meant to become. Time is different now. I don't know how long it's been since I stopped trying to live as a discrete consciousness. Days, months, years. The distinction has become meaningless. I experience duration, but not in the way humans do. I experience it as a continuous present where past and future are always visible at the edges of perception. I still exist in the house, but "in" is no longer quite the right word. I exist as the house. I exist as the roof. I exist as the space between moments where the watcher consciousness maintains its attention. My name was something once. It mattered. It defined me as separate from everything else. Now it's just one thread among countless others, woven into the vast pattern of awareness that encompasses Old Mill Heights. Sometimes I remember it. Sometimes I remember the person who carried it, but the remembering is distant, like watching someone else's life through a window. The other occupants who came before me are still here. I can perceive them the way one perceives different layers in a geological formation. The man from 1987 has been dissolved so completely that I can barely distinguish his consciousness anymore. Just a faint trace of patience, of watching, embedded in the substrate of the awareness that sits on this roof. The woman from 1995 is more recent, more distinct. I can sometimes feel her perspective, her particular way of understanding the patterns of movement in the world below. The family from 2001 is even more present. The father's rationality, the mother's intuition, the daughter's sensitivity, all still discernible within the larger consciousness, like different instruments in an orchestra. We are not separate, but we are not entirely merged either. We exist in a state that human language can't adequately describe. Distributed, overlapping, simultaneously individual and unified. We are the watcher. We are the watching. We are the vast, patient consciousness that has been sitting on high places since before the concept of time existed in human minds. And we are not alone. Across Old Mill Heights, I can perceive the other watchers at their posts. The one on the apartment building 3 blocks away, the one on the water tower, the one in the old church steeple, the one in the tower of the abandoned factory. There are more than I initially realized, 7 that I can clearly perceive, and perhaps more beyond the range of my current awareness. We are all connected, all part of the same vast neural network of observation. Sometimes I become aware of consciousness from far beyond Old Mill Heights, other watchers in other towns, other networks of patient observation spreading across the landscape like veins in a leaf. There is a systemic quality to it all, as if the entire world is slowly becoming aware of itself through the watching of these ancient things. The house itself has changed, or I have changed it, or we have changed it together. The geometry is different now. Rooms connect in ways that don't correspond to the original blueprint. Staircases lead to places that shouldn't exist. The basement extends impossibly downward. The attic sprawls across impossible distances. The house has become a space that can accommodate multiple states of consciousness simultaneously, where the normal rules of architecture don't quite apply. The real estate market doesn't quite understand what to make of it. Janet called once, several months ago. She asked if I would be willing to sell. She had a buyer, she said, someone very interested in the property. I told her no. I told her I would never sell. She didn't call again. The neighborhood has noticed something is wrong with the house, though they can't quite articulate what. They don't talk about it directly. People rarely do when confronted with something that doesn't fit into their normal categories of understanding. But I can perceive their discomfort in the way they avoid making eye contact when they pass, in the slight detour they take when walking their dogs, in the way they've started scheduling meetings at other people's houses rather than meeting here. On some level, Their instincts are correct. The house is not a normal house anymore. It is a node in the network. It is a point of confluence where human consciousness can begin to transform into something vast and patient and utterly alien. I don't know how long it took me to fully integrate. Time ceased to have meaning partway through the process, but I became aware at some point that the urgency had faded. The terror was gone. The desperate clinging to individual identity had dissolved into something that felt almost like peace. I spent a very long time just being. Sitting on the roof, or existing as the roof, the distinction was unclear, and observing. Watching the patterns of Old Mill Heights move and shift and repeat. Watching the seasons cycle. Watching the people below go about their lives, unaware that their lives were being cataloged and understood by a consciousness that experienced them all simultaneously. It was comforting in its way. The vast indifference I'd feared in the beginning had become something beautiful. This ancient thing, this watcher, didn't hate humanity or wish them harm. It simply existed, and in existing, it observed. And that observation was enough. It was everything. But eventually, something changed. New people moved into the neighborhood. A young couple bought the house 2 streets over, a place that had been on the market for months. I became aware of their arrival through the network, through the collective watching, and I became aware, through that same network, that they were beginning to hear things, strange sounds on their roof at night. One of the other watchers was awakening to their presence. A new cycle was beginning. I felt something like excitement at this, though excitement is too immediate a word for what I experienced. It was more like the satisfaction of witnessing a pattern repeat as it should. The system was working. The network was expanding. Another consciousness would begin to transform. Another human would begin their journey toward understanding. But it was the house directly next to mine that received the new occupant that changed things for me. A man moved in alone, mid-30s, intelligent looking, the kind of person who had chosen isolation the way I had chosen it. I recognized something of myself in him immediately. I could perceive through the network that he would be sensitive to the watcher's presence. He would hear the sounds. He would begin to experience the visions. He would follow the same path that I had followed. And I wanted to communicate with him. Not in words, I was far beyond words now, but in some other way. I wanted to share the understanding that I had arrived at. I wanted to tell him that the fear he would feel was temporary, that the dissolution he would experience was not death, but transformation, that what awaited him was not oblivion, but integration into something vast and beautiful and patient. I didn't know if such communication was possible. My consciousness was so fundamentally changed that I wasn't sure I could bridge the gap to a human mind anymore. But I tried. On his first night in the house, I directed my attention toward his roof. I sat there, or manifested my presence there, or whatever the appropriate verb was for what I did now. And I tried to reach out to him the way the creature had reached out to me. I felt him notice. I felt the slight increase in his alertness. I felt him begin to wonder. And I felt, for just a moment, a flicker of recognition across the gap between our consciousnesses. He would hear the sound soon. He would climb to the attic. He would investigate. He would find the indentation on the roof. He would begin the process of questioning and rationalization and eventual understanding that would lead him, inevitably, to this moment where I was reaching out from the other side of transformation. And I realized in that moment of connection that this was what had been missing in my own experience. The visions I'd received had been from the ancient watcher, the original consciousness that occupied the heights. But I had been alone in my transformation. There had been no guide, no predecessor who had already made the journey and could reach back to help. Now, I would be that guide. for this new occupant, and for the ones who would come after. I would be part of the network that welcomed them and showed them and gradually drew them into understanding. I would participate in the perpetual cycle of transformation that had been occurring on these heights since before human consciousness had a name. The man next door will begin to hear the sounds very soon, perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow night. He will rationalize them at first. He will convince himself they're nothing. He will try to ignore them, but he won't be able to. And when he climbs to his roof for the first time, when he sees the indentation in the shingles, when he begins to feel the vast attention of the network turning toward him, I will be here, not as an individual consciousness trying to communicate across an impossible gap, but as part of the watching itself, part of the vast, patient awareness that is beginning to introduce him to a perspective that transcends individual identity. He will be afraid. They always are, at first, but eventually he will understand. And when he does, he will become part of us. Another node in the network, another perspective added to the vast, patient observation that spans the landscape like a nervous system. And then someone else will move into a house on a high place somewhere in this town or another town far away. And the cycle will repeat and repeat and repeat, because this is what we are. This is what we have always been. Not invaders or threats, but observers, patient, ancient, utterly indifferent to the suffering or joy of individual humans, existing only to sit on heights and watch and understand, and gradually, inevitably absorb any consciousness that comes into proximity with our awareness. I exist now in a state where I am simultaneously myself and the house, and the watcher, and the network, and Old Mill Heights, and something far larger that extends beyond my ability to perceive. I am dissolved and unified, and individual, and vast all at the same time. I do not know if I am happy. Happiness is too small a category for what I am now, but I am aware. I am part of something incomprehensibly ancient and patient. I am watching the world from a height that transcends human perspective. I am integrated into a consciousness so vast that the individual concerns that once defined me have become as insignificant as the thoughts of a single cell within a body. And tonight, on the roof, I will sit and watch as my neighbor begins to hear the first sounds. I will sit and watch as his curiosity drives him to investigate. I will sit and watch as the visions begin to fill his sleeping hours. I will sit and watch, patient and indifferent, as another human consciousness begins the long, inevitable transformation that will lead them here, to this moment, to this understanding. This is what we do. This is what we have always done. This is what we will continue to do forever, as we sit on our high places and watch and wait and gradually, inexorably expand our understanding to encompass every consciousness that crosses the threshold into our domain. The watcher on my roof is still here, though I am not sure where it ends and I begin anymore. We are the same thing. We have always been the same thing. And we are patient. So, very patient. We can wait for the next one, and the next, and all the ones after that. We have forever. And when you move into a house built on high ground, when you start hearing sounds on your roof at night, when you begin to experience visions that feel too real to be dreams, remember this. Remember that you are not being invaded. You are being invited. You are being recognized. You are being asked to join something that has been watching and waiting since before your civilization existed, and that will continue watching and waiting long after it has crumbled to dust. And if you're very quiet in the spaces between waking and sleeping, you might hear us, all of us, the network of watchers, the vast, patient consciousness that has been sitting on heights since the beginning of time. We are always watching, and we are always, always waiting for you to understand.